Chapter 2. Ar. Cuorus of the caste of assassins entered the great gate of the city of Ar. Guardsmen did not detain him, for he wore on his forehead the mark of the black dagger. Not for many years had the black tunic of the assassins been seen within the walls of Ar, not since the siege of that city in 1110, from its founding, in the days of Marlenus, who had been Ubar, and of Parkour, who had been master of the assassins, and of the Coriban warrior in the songs called Tal of Bristol. For years the black of the assassins had been outlawed in the city. Parkour, who had been master of the assassins, had led a league of tributary cities to attack Imperial Ar at the time when its home stone had been stolen and its Ubar forced to flee. The city had fallen, and Parkour, though of low caste, had aspired to inherit the imperial mantle of Marlenus, had dared to lift his eyes to the throne of empire and place about his neck the golden medallion of an Ubar, a thing forbidden to such as he in the myths of the counter-earth. Parkour's horde had been defeated by an alliance of free cities, led by Coribar and Thentis, under the command of Matthew Cabot of Coribar, the father of Tal of Bristol, and Khazrak of Port Car, sword-brother of the same warrior. Tal of Bristol himself, on the windy height of Ar's cylinder of justice, had defeated Parkour, master assassins. From that time the black of the assassins had not been seen in the streets of glorious Ar. Yet none would stand in the way of Cuorus, for he wore on his forehead, small and fine, the sign of the black dagger. When he of the caste of assassins has been paid his gold, and has received his charge, he affixes on his forehead that sign, that he may enter whatever city he pleases, that none may interfere with his work. There are few men who have done great wrong, or who have powerful rich enemies, who do not tremble upon learning that one has been brought to their city who wears the dagger. Cuorus stepped between the great gates and looked about himself. A woman carrying a market basket moved to one side, watching him that she might not touch him, holding a child to her. A peasant moved away, that the shadow of the assassin might not fall across his own. Cuorus pointed to a fruit on a flat-topped wagon with wooden wheels, drawn by four-legged horned Thalarian. The pedlar pressed the fruit into his hands and hurried on, not meeting his eyes. Her back against the bricks of a tower near the gate, a slender, slim-ankled slave girl stood watching him. Her eyes were frightened. Cuorus was apparently the first of the caste of assassins she had seen. Her hair was dark and fell to the small of her back. Her eyes were dark. She wore the briefly skirted, sleeveless slave livery common in the northern cities of Gore. The livery was yellow and split to the cord that served her as a belt. About her throat she wore the matching collar, yellow enamelled over steel. Biting into the fruit, the juice running at the side of his mouth, Cuorus studied the girl. It seemed she would turn to leave, but his eyes held her where she stood. He spit some seeds into the dust of the street within the gate. When he had finished, he threw the core of the fruit at her feet, and she looked down at it with horror. When she looked up frightened, she felt his hand upon her left arm. He turned her around and thrust her down a side street, making her walk in front of him. At a Parga tavern, one near the gate, cheap and crowded, dingy and smelling, a place frequented by strangers and small merchants, the assassin took the girl by the arm and thrust her within. Those in the tavern looked up from the low tables. There were 3 musicians against one wall. They stopped playing. The slave girls in pleasure silk turned and stood stock still. The Parga flasks cradled over their right forearms. Not even the bells locked to their left ankles made a sound. Not a parga bowl was lifted, nor a hand moved. The men looked at the assassin, who regarded them one by one. Men turned white under that gaze. Some fled from the tables, lest, unknown to themselves, it had been they for whom this man wore the mark of the black dagger. The assassin turned to the man in a black apron, a fat, grimy man who wore a soiled tunic of white and gold, stained with sweat and spilled parga. "Kolla," said the assassin. The man took a key from the line of hooks on the wall behind him. "7," he said, throwing the assassin the key. The assassin caught the key, and taking the girl by the arm, led her to a dark wall in a low-ceilinged corner of the sloping room. She moved woodenly, as though numb. Her eyes seemed frightened. There were one or two other girls there, kneeling, who drew back with the sound of a chain. He thrust the dark-haired girl to her knees by the 7th collar and snapped it about her neck, turning the key, locking it. It gave her about a 2-foot length of chain, fastened to a slave ring bolted into the stone. And then he looked down on her. Her eyes were lifted to his, frightened. The yellow of her livery seemed dark in the shadows. From where she knelt, she could see the low-hanging Thalarian oil lamps of the main portion of the Parga tavern. The men, the girls in silk, who, in a moment Beld would move among them, replenishing the Parga. In under a hanging lamp there was a square area, recessed, filled with sand, in which men might fight or girls dance. Beyond the area of the sand and many of the tables there was a high wall, some 20 feet or so high, in which there were 4 levels, each containing 7 small curtained alcoves, the entrances to which were circular, with a diameter of about 24 inches. 7 narrow ladders, each about 8 inches in width, fixed into the wall, gave access to these alcoves. She saw Kouros go to the tables and sit cross-legged behind one, a table against the wall on her left, that there might be no tables behind him, but only the wall. The men who had been at that table or near it silently rose and left the area. Kouros had placed his spear against the wall behind him, and had taken from his left shoulder his shield, his helmet, and the sheathed short sword, which blade he had placed on his right hand on the low table. At a gesture from the proprietor, the grimy man in the tunic of white and gold, one of the serving slaves, with a flash of ankle bells, hurried to the assassin and set before him a bowl, which she, trembling, filled from the flask held over her right forearm. And then, with a furtive glance at the girl chained at the side of the room, the serving girl hurried away. Kouros took the parga bowl in both hands and put his head down, looking into it, and then sombrely he lifted it to his lips and drank. Putting down the bowl, he wiped his mouth on his forearm and looked at the musicians. "Play," he said. The 3 musicians bent to their instruments, and in a moment there was again the sound of a Parga tavern, the sounds of talk, of barbaric music, of pouring Parga, the clink of bowls, the rustling of bells on the ankles of slave girls. Scarcely a quarter of an hour had passed, and the men who drank in that room had forgotten, as is the way of men, that a dark one sat with them in that room, one who wore the black tunic of the caste of assassins, who silently drank with them. It was enough for them that he who sat with them did not this time wear for them the mark of the black dagger on his forehead, that it was not they whom he sought. Kouros drank, watching the people. His face showed no emotion. Suddenly a small figure burst through the door of the tavern, stumbling and rolling down the stairs, crying out. It got to its feet like a small hunched animal, with a large head and wild brown hair. One eye was larger than the other. It could stand, even if it straightened, no higher than a man's waist. "Do not hurt Hup," it cried. "Do not hurt Hup." "It's Hup the fool," said someone. The little thing, misshapen with its large head, scrambled, limping and leaping like a broken-legged Urt to the counter, behind which stood the man in the grimy tunic, who was wiping out a parga bowl. "Hide, Hup!" cried the thing. "Hide, Hup! Please hide, Hup!" "Be off with you, Hup the fool!" cried the man, slapping at him with the back of his hand. "No!" screamed Hup. "They want to kill Hup!" "There's no place for beggars in glorious R," growled one of the men at the tables. Hup's rag might once have been of the cast of potters, but it was difficult to tell. His hands looked as though they might have been broken. Clearly one leg was shorter than the other. Hup wrung his tiny misshapen hands, looking around. He had tried foolishly to hide behind a group of men, but they threw him to the centre of the pit of sand in the tavern. He tried, like a frantic animal, to crawl under one of the low tables, but he only spilled the parga, and the men pulled him out from under the table and belaboured his back with blows of their fists. He kept whimpering and screaming and running one place or the other, and then, in spite of the angry shout of the proprietor, he scrambled over the counter, taking refuge behind it. The men in the tavern, with the exception of Chorus, laughed. Then, a moment later, 4 men, armed, brawny men, with a streamer of blue and yellow silk sewn diagonally into their garments, burst through the door and entered the room. "Where is Hup the fool?" cried their leader, a large fellow with missing teeth and a scar over his right eye. The men began to hunt around the room angrily. "Where is Hup the fool?" demanded the leader of the 4 men of the proprietor. I shall have to look for him," said the proprietor, winking at the fellow with the missing teeth, who grinned. "Oh, no," said the proprietor, apparently looking about with great care behind the counter. "Hup the fool does not seem to be here." The proprietor leant down. "It looks as though we must search elsewhere," said the leader of the 4 men, attempting to sound disappointed. "It appears so," said the proprietor, and then, after a cruel pause, the proprietor suddenly cried out, "No! Wait! Here is something!" And reaching down to his feet behind the counter, he picked up the small animal mass that was Hup the fool, which shrieked with fear, and hurled it into the arms of the man with the missing teeth, who laughed. "Why," cried the man with missing teeth, "it is he! It is Hup the fool!" "Mercy, masters!" cried Hup, squealing, struggling in the grasp of the captor. The other 3 men, hired swords, perhaps once of the cast of warriors, laughed at the frantic efforts of the tiny snivelling wad of flesh to free itself. Many in the crowd laughed at the small fool's discomfort. Hup was indeed an ugly thing, for he was small and yet thick, almost bulbous, under the dirty tunic, perhaps that of the potters, there bulged a hump of some grotesque growth. One of his legs was shorter than the other, his head was too large for his body and swollen to the left. One eye was larger than the other. His tiny feet thrashed about, kicking at the man who held him. "Are you truly going to kill him?" asked one of the patrons at the low table. "This time he dies," said the man who held Hup. "He has dared to speak the name of Portus and beg a coin from him." Now Goreans do not generally favour begging, and some regard it as an insult that there should be such, an insult to them and their city. When charity is in order, as when a man cannot work or a woman is alone, usually such is arranged through the caste organisation, but sometimes through the clan, which is not specifically caste-orientated, but depends on ties of blood through the 5th degree. If one, of course, finds oneself in effect without caste or clan, as was perhaps the case with the small fool named Hup, and one cannot work, one's life is likely to be miserable and not of great length. Moreover, Goreans are extremely sensitive about names and who may speak them. Indeed, some, particularly those of low caste, have even used names, concealing their true names, lest they be discovered by enemies and used to conjure spells against them. Similarly, slaves, on the whole, do not address free men by their names. Chorus surmised that Portus, doubtless a man of importance, had been troubled by the little fool Hupp on more than one occasion, and had now decided to do away with him. The man who held the snivelling Hupp held him with one hand and struck at him with the other, and then threw him to one of his three fellows, who similarly abused him. The crowd in the tavern reacted with amusement at the small animal-like body as it was buffeted and thrown about, sometimes flung against the wall or on the tables. At last, bleeding and scarcely able to whine, Hupp curled himself into a small trembling ball, his head between his legs, his hands holding his ankles. The four men, then having between them in the pit of sand, kicked him again and again, and then the large man with missing teeth seized Hupp's hair and pulled up his head to expose the throat, holding it in his right hand a small, thick, curved blade, the hook knife of Ar, used sheath in the sport of that name, but the knife was not now sheathed. The eyes of tiny Hupp were screwed shut, his body shivering like that of an Urt clenched in the teeth of a sleen. "Keep him on the sand," warned the proprietor of the tavern. He with the missing teeth laughed and looked around the crowd, his eyes bright, seeing that they waited with eagerness for his stroke. But his laugh died in his throat as he looked into the eyes of Chorus, he of the caste of assassins. Chorus, with his left hand, pushed to one side his bowl of paga. Hupp opened his eyes, startled at not yet having felt the deep, cruel movement of the steel. He too looked into the eyes of Chorus, who sat in the darkness, the wall behind him, cross-legged, looking at him, no emotion on his face. "You are a beggar?" asked Chorus. "Yes, master," said Hupp. "Was the begging good today?" asked Chorus. Hupp looked at him in fear. "Oh, yes, master, yes." "Then you have money," said Chorus, and stood up behind the table, slinging the sheath of the short sword around his shoulder. Hupp wildly thrust a small stubby knobby hand into his pouch and hurled a coin, a copper tandis, to Chorus, who caught it and placed it in one of the pockets of his belt. "Do not interfere," snarled the man who held the hook knife. "There are four of us," and putting his hand on his sword. "I have taken money," said Chorus. The men in the tavern and the girls began to move away from the tables. "We are warriors." And then a coin of gold struck the table before the assassin, ringing on the wood. All eyes turned to face a paunchy man in a robe of blue and yellow silk. "I am Portus," he said. "Do not interfere, assassin." Chorus picked up the coin and fingered it, and then he looked at Portus. "I have already taken money," he said. Portus gasped. The four warriors rose to their feet. 5 blades leapt from the sheath with but one sound. Hupp, whining, crawled away from the sand on his hands and knees. The first warrior lunged towards the assassin, but in the darkness of the side room, in the dim light of the Thalarian lamps, it was difficult to tell what happened. No one heard the striking of sword steel, but all saw the turning body of the man with the missing teeth falling sprawled over a low table. And then the dark shape of the assassin seemed to move like a swift shadow in the room, and each of the 3 warriors leapt towards him, but seemed to fail to find him, and another man, without even the flash of sword steel, dropped to his knees and fell forward in the pit of sand. The other 2 men struck as well, but their blades didn't even meet that of the assassin, who did not seem to deign to cross steel with them. The third man soundlessly turned away from the blade of the assassin, seeming surprised, took 2 steps, and fell. The fourth man lunged, but failed to meet the shadow that seemed to move to one side, and now, before the fourth man had fallen, the shadow had resheathed its blade. Now the assassin picked up the coin of gold and looked at the startled, sweating Portus. And then the assassin threw the coin to the feet of Hup the Fool. "A gift to Hup the Fool," said the assassin, "from Portus, who is kind." Hup seized the coin of gold and scrambled from the room like an Urt running through an open gate of a trap. Chorus returned to his table and sat down cross-legged as before. Once more the short sword lay at his right hand on the table. He lifted his parga bowl and drank. Chorus had not finished the bowl of parga when he sensed a man approaching. The right hand of Chorus now lay on the hilt of the short sword. The man was Portus, heavy, paunchy, in blue and yellow silk. He approached gingerly, his hands open, held from his body ingratiatingly, smiling. He sat down wheezing across from Chorus, and placed his hands deliberately on his knees. Chorus said nothing, but observed him. The man smiled, but Chorus did not smile. "Welcome, killer," said the man, addressing the assassin by what, for that caste, is a title of respect. Chorus didn't move. "I must protect myself," said the man, smiling, as the blade of Chorus lifted itself through the sleeve, parting the silk, revealing the sheath strapped to his forearm. Not taking his eyes from the man, Chorus cut the straps on the sheath from the man's forearm, and with a small movement of his blade threw the sheath and its dagger some feet to the side. "I am of the opinion," said the man, "that is a good thing. We have those in black tunic back amongst us." Chorus nodded, accepting the judgment. "Bring parga," called the paunchy man imperiously, impatiently to one of the girls, who hastened to obey him. And then he turned again to Chorus and smiled ingratiatingly. "It has been hard enough," said the man, "since the deposition of Khazrak of Portkar as administrator of the city, and since the murder of Om, the high initiate of the city." Chorus had heard of these things. Khazrak, who had been administrator of the city for several years, had finally been deposed, largely due to the agitations of certain factions among the initiates and merchants who had had their various grievances against the administrator. Khazrak had offended the caste of initiates primarily by levying taxes on their vast holdings throughout the city, and upon occasion upholding the rulings of the administrative courts over the courts of the initiates. The initiates, in their interpretations of sacrifices and in their preachments, primarily to the low castes, had led many of the city to fear that Khazrak might not long enjoy the favour of the priest-kings. After the murder of Om, who had been in tolerable terms with the administrator, the new high initiate, Complicius Soranus, in studying the omens of the white bosks slain in the harvest festival, had, to his apparent horror, discovered that they had stood against Khazrak. Other initiates wished to examine these omens being read in the state of the bosk's liver, but Complicius Soranus, as though in terror, had cast the liver into the fire, presumably that such dark portents might be immediately destroyed. He had then collapsed, weeping on the pillar of sacrifice, for it was well known that he had been a beloved friend of the administrator. It was from this time that Khazrak might clearly have been said, particularly among the lower castes, to have lost the confidence of the city. He was further in danger by virtue of his controlling measures, restricting certain monopolies important to certain factions among the merchants, in particular those having to do with the manufacture of bricks and the distribution of salt and thalarian oil. He had further imposed restrictions on the games and contests of Ar, such that the loss of life became infrequent, even among competing slaves. It was argued that the citizens of Ar could scarcely remain strong and fearless unless accustomed to the sight of blood, of danger and death. And since Khazrak was originally, perhaps surprisingly, of Port Kar, a city on not particularly good terms with Ar, or any other Gorian city, there was a hint of sedition in such matters. Moreover, Khazrak had been one of the leaders of the forces that had preserved Ar in its time of troubles with Pa-Akur, master of assassins. As the tale was now told in the streets, the men of Ar themselves alone had overthrown the invaders. Thus Khazrak seemed a living reminder that glorious Ar had once needed the aid of other cities, and men other than her own. Whereas it is only the men of high caste who elect members to the council of the city, the gold of merchants and the will of the general populace is seldom disregarded in their choices. Accordingly, Khazrak of Port Kar, for years administrator of Ar, was by vote deposed and banished from the city, being publicly denied salt, bread, and fire, as, long years before him, had been Marlenus, once Ubar of Ar. Khazrak, with loyal followers, and the beautiful Sana of Thentis, his consort, had left the city months before. Their whereabouts were unknown, but it was thought that they had hoped to find and found a colony on one of the islands of Thassa, further north than even Kos and Tyrus. The new administrator of Ar was a man named Minos Tentius Hinrabius, an unimportant man except for being of the Hinrabian family, prominent among the builders, having the major holdings in the vast walled Hinrabian kilns where much of Ar's brick is produced. "It is hard in Ar," said the paunchy man Porters, "since Khazrak has gone." Kura said nothing. "There seems little law now," said Porters. "When one goes out at night, even on the high bridges, one must have men with one. It is not well to walk among the cylinders after dark without torches and steel." "Do the warriors no longer guard the streets?" asked Chorus. "Oh, some," said Porters, "but not enough. Men are engaged in the border disputes as far distant as Acartius. Moreover, the caravans of merchants are now given large and free guard." "Surely there are many warriors in the city?" said Chorus. "Oh, yes," said Porters, "but they do little. They are well paid, more than twice what was done before, but they spend the mornings in practices with arms, and the afternoons and evenings in the tavern, the gaming rooms, and the baths of the city." "There are swords for hire?" asked Chorus. "Oh, yes," said Porters, "and the rich merchants and the grand houses, those on the street of coins and on the street of brands, hire their own men." He smiled. "Further," he said, "merchants arm and train squads of such men and rent them for high wages to the citizens of given streets and cylinders." Chorus lifted his parga bowl and drank. "What has this to do with me?" he asked. "For whom do you wear on your forehead the mark of the black dagger?" queried Porters discreetly. Chorus said nothing. "Perhaps I could tell you where to find him," proposed Porters. "I will find him," said Chorus. "Oh, of course," said Porters, "of course." The heavy man sitting cross-legged opposite the assassin began to sweat, fiddled with the damp blue and yellow silk covering his knee, and then with a nervous hand lifted a shaking bowl of parga to his lips, spilling some down the side of his face. I meant no harm," he said. "You are alive," said Chorus. "May I ask, killer," said Porters, "if you come to make the first killing or the second?" "The second," said Chorus. "Ah," said Porters. "I hunt," said Chorus. "Of course," said Paul. "I come to avenge," said Chorus. Porter smiled. "Oh, that is what I meant," he said. "There is good in those in the black tunic are once again amongst us, that justice can be done, order restored, right upheld." Curus looked at him, the eyes not smiling. "There is only gold and steel," he said. "Oh, of course," hastily agreed Portus. "That is very true." "Why did you come to speak with me?" "I would hire such a sword as yours," said Portus. "I hunt," said Curus. "Ar is a vast city," said Portus. "Perhaps it will take you time to find he whom you seek." Curus's eyes flickered. Portus leant forward. "And meanwhile," he said, "you might earn considerable sums. I have work for such men as you, and much of the time you would be free to hunt as you wished. Matters might well work out to our mutual advantage." "Who are you?" said Curus. "I am that Portus," said he, "who is master of the house of Portus." Curus had heard of the house of Portus, one of the largest of the slave houses in the street of Brands. He had known, of course, from the gown of blue and yellow silk that the man was a slaver. "What is it that you fear?" asked Curus. "There is a house greater than mine, or any other on the street of Brands." "You fear this house?" asked Curus. "Those of this house stand near the administrator and the high initiate," said Portus. "What do you mean?" asked Curus. "The gold of this house is heavy in the councils of the city." "The administrator and the high initiate owe their thrones to the gold of this house?" Portus laughed bitterly. "Without the gold of this house, how could the administrator and the high initiate have sponsored the races and the games that won them the favour of the lower castes?" "Oh, but the lower castes do not elect the administrator or the high initiate," said Curus. "The administrator is appointed by the high council of the city, and the high initiate by the high council of the initiates of the city." "These councils," said Portus scornfully, "know well the way the lower castes yelp in the tears," and he snorted. "And there are many in the high council of the city who, if forced to decide between the steel of the hook knife and the feel of gold in their perch, will choose gold to steel." Portus winked at Curus. "There is only gold and steel." Curus did not smile. Portus hastily pushed his parga bowl up to his mouth and swilled again, his eyes wary of the assassin from across from him. "Where does this house obtain riches such that they may so easily outbid all other factions in Ar?" "It is a rich house," said Portus, looking around. "It is a rich house." "That rich?" asked Curus. "I do not know where the gold comes from, for all of it," said Portus. "My own house could not begin to sponsor the games of even 2 days, or we would be bankrupt." "And of what interest is this house to you?" asked Curus. "It wants to be the single slave house of Ar," whispered Portus. Curus smiled. "My house," said Portus, "is 20 generations old. We have bred, captured, trained, exchanged and sold slaves for half a millennium. The house of Portus is known on all Gaul." Portus looked down. "Already 6 houses on the street of Brands have been purchased or closed." "Well, there's never been a monopoly on slaves in Ar," said Curus. "That is the wish, however, of the house of which I speak," said Portus. "Does it not offend you? Are you not outraged? Even in terms of merchandise and prices, cannot you see what it would mean? Even now the lesser houses find it difficult to acquire premium slaves, and when we obtain them we are undersold. Few go to the lesser houses to buy slaves this year in Ar." "How can this house of which you speak," asked Curus, "undersell so consistently? Is it that the number of slaves is so great that the profit taken on each is less?" "I have thought long on it," said Portus, "and that cannot be all of it. I know this business well. The costs of information, organisation, planning, acquisition, transportation and security, the care and feeding and training of the animals, the guards, the cost of the auctions, the taxes on sales, the deliveries to certain cities, and the staff of the house I speak of is large, skilled, highly paid, and their facilities are unparalleled in the city, both in size and in appointments. They have interior baths which could rival the pools even of the Capasian baths." Portus nodded in puzzlement. "No," said Portus, "they must have sources of gold other than the income on their merchandise." Portus pushed one finger around in a puddle of splashed parga on the low table. "I thought for a time," he said, "that they had intended to sell at a radical loss until the other slave houses were forced to close, and then to recoup their losses with profit by setting their own prices. But then when I considered again the gold which sponsored the games and races, honouring the men who were to become administrator and high initiate, I decided it could not be. I am convinced the house of which I speak has major sources of gold other than the income on their merchandise." Chorus did not speak. "There is another thing about that house I do not understand," said Portus. "What?" said Chorus. "The number of barbarian women they place on their block," said Portus. Well, there have always been barbarian women on Gaul," said Chorus, dismissing the remark of Portus. "Not in such numbers," grumbled Portus, and he looked at Chorus. "Have you any idea of the expense of acquiring barbarian women from beyond the cities, the distances involved? Normally they can be brought in only one at a time, on tarnback. A caravan of common slave wagons would take a year to go beyond the cities and return." "Well, 100 townsmen, well organised," said Chorus, "could strike barbarian villages, bind 100 wenches, and return in 20 days. "True," said Portus, "but commonly such raids take place on cylinders in given cities. The distances beyond the cities are great, and the prices paid for mere barbarian girls are less." Chorus shrugged. "Moreover," said Portus, "these are not common barbarian wenches." Chorus looked up. "Few of them have even a smattering of Gorean, and they act strangely. They beg and weep and whine. One would think they had never seen a slave collar or slave chains before. Oh, they are beautiful, but they are stupid. The only thing they understand is the whip." Portus looked down, disgusted. "Men even go to see them sold out of curiosity, for they either stand there numb, not moving, or scream and fight, or cry out in their barbarian tongues." Portus looked up. "But the lashers teach them what is expected of them on the block, and they then present themselves well, and some bring fair prices in spite of being barbarian." "I gather," said Chorus, "that you wish to hire my sword, that you may in some degree protect yourself from the men and the plans of the house of which you have spoken." "It is true," said Portus. "When gold will not do, only steel can meet steel." You say that this house of which you speak is the largest and richest, most powerful on the street of Brands?" "Yes," said Portus. "What is the name of this house?" asked Chorus. "The House of Cernus," said Portus. "I shall permit my sword to be hired," said Chorus. "Oh, good!" cried Portus, his hands on the table, his eyes gleaming. "Good!" "By the House of Cernus," said the assassin. The eyes of Portus were wide, and his body trembled. He rose unsteadily to his feet and staggered backwards. Shaking his head, turned and stumbled over one of the low tables and fled from the room. His drink finished, Chorus rose and went to the darkened corner of the room, where the wall sloped down. He looked into the eyes of the girl in the yellow slave livery who knelt there, and then he turned the key in the lock of the collar 7 and released her. Thrusting her to her feet and forcing her to walk before him, he went to the counter, behind which stood the man in the grimy tunic of white and gold. Chorus threw the key to him. "Use 27, said the man, handing Chorus a bit of silk, pleasure silk, wrapped about a set of slave chains. Chorus threw the silk and chain over his shoulder and motioned to the girl to move ahead of him. Numbly she did so, crossing the room, going between the tables, and stopping before the narrow ladder on the right side of the high wall, in which were found the ledges with their alcoves. Not speaking, but woodenly, she climbed the ladder and crawled into the shelf near the tiny alcove marked with the Gorean equivalent of 27, and entered, followed by Chorus, who drew the curtains behind them. The alcove, with its enclosing curved walls, was only about 4 feet high and 5 feet wide. It was lit by one small lamp set in a niche in the wall. It was lined with red silk, and floored with love furs and cushions, the furs being better than some 6 to 8 inches deep. In the alcove the demeanour of the girl changed, and she suddenly rolled on her back and lifted one knee. She looked at him saucily. "I've never been to one of these places before," she said. Chorus tossed the silk and the chain to one side of the alcove and grinned at her. "I now understand," she said, "why it is that the free women never enter a Parker tavern." "But you are only a slave girl," said Chorus. "Oh, true," she said forlornly, turning her head to one side. Chorus removed her slave livery. The girl sat up, her eyes bright, holding her ankles with her hands. "So this is what these places are like," she said, looking around. "Do you like them?" asked Chorus. "Well," she said demurely, looking down, "they make a girl feel rather well." "Precisely," agreed Chorus. "I see that I shall have to bring you here often." "That might be pleasant," she said, "master." He fingered the collar on her throat, yellow enamelled over steel. It bore the legend, "I am the property of the house of Chernus." "I would like," he said, "to remove the collar." "Unfortunately," she said, "the key reposes in the house of Chernus." "It's a dangerous thing you are doing, Elizabeth," said Chorus. "You'd best call me Vella," she said, "for that is the name I am known by in the house of Chernus." He gathered her in his arms, and she kissed him. "I have missed you," she said, "Tal Cabot." "And I have missed you, too," I said. I kissed her. "We must speak of our work," I mumbled, "our plans and our purposes, and how we may achieve them." "The business of the priest-kings and such," she said, "is surely less important than our present activities." I mumbled something, but she would hear nothing of it, and suddenly, feeling her in my arms, I laughed and held her to me, and she laughed and whispered, "I love you, Tal Cabot." And I said to her, "Chorus, Chorus of the caste of assassins." And she said, "Yes, Chorus, and poor Vella of the house of Chernus, picked up on the street and brought to this place, given no choice but to serve the pleasure of a man who is not even her master. Cruel Chorus." And we fell to kissing and touching and loving, and after some time she whispered, eyes bright, "Ah, Chorus, you well know how to use a wench." "Be quiet," Chorus told her, "slave girl." "Yes, master," she said. clever master. I reached over and put the bit of pleasure silk under her, that it might be wrinkled and bear the stains of her sweat. "Be silent, slave girl," I warned her, and she heeded my injunction, for she then, for better than an An, served in a silence that was exquisite, broken only by our breathing, her small moans and cries. And that's the end of the chapter.